So this weekend we have Joshua Buatsi taking on Dan Azeez for the Commonwealth and British light heavyweight titles. Now I've got to give a shout out to G-Man because if it wasn't for him doing his video on this a few days ago, I've actually forgotten it was taking place. I don't know whether I've just been living under a rock or whether the promotion for this fight has been subpar at best. But yeah, not a great amount of fanfare around this fight. Um, as I say, I have been quite busy, which explains the lack of content on the channel. But nevertheless, let's talk about this one because I do think that this is an interesting fight. It has the ingredients, albeit quite cliche. If you look at this fight on paper, you've got two guys, it's very similar stages of their careers. Dan Azeez, 20-0. He's 34 years old. He's been a pro since 2017, compared to Joshua Buatsi, who's 17-0. I believe Buatsi is 30 years of age and has also been a pro since 2017. So we've got two guys, relatively young, dare I say, getting on a bit, at least relative to me. Very similar stage of their careers, very similar record. It's a domestic clash. It's got the British title on the line, which historically has produced some very entertaining fights. So I'm intrigued to see how this one goes down. It's going to be interesting to see who comes out on top and who implements what game plan. Talking about perceptions of the fighters themselves, I think it's fair to say that Joshua Buatsi, if we start with him, is a fighter who seems to blow hot and cold. I think many people have been disappointed with Joshua Buatsi in recent years, despite him having quite a bright start in the beginning of his career. I was actually saying to a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago that the last time I was genuinely impressed with Joshua Buatsi was in the 2016 Olympics. And I remember watching him thinking, this guy's good. He's real good. I liked his style, and I just thought, you know what, he's doing well in the Olympics now, but I think when he turns over and when he becomes a pro, his style is going to be much better suited to professional boxing. And yeah, he got off to a good start. I remember there was a fair bit of hype around Joshua Buatsi because he was looking devastating. He had that viciousness, which has really become one of his trademarks. And, fighting a lower level of opposition, he's really, he back then he was dealing with people the way he should have. But I think since his career has advanced and the level of competition has stepped up, we've seen Joshua Buatsi not really deliver the goods. He's carried on winning to his credit, but it hasn't really been anything to set the world alight. That's what I'll say. And now some of it isn't Joshua Buatsi's fault. He's had to deal with contractual issues, especially recently, which is, it's never good for fighters because it's always going to play on their mind, or in many cases it will. It can take away from their performances. But even when Joshua Buatsi has had his moment to shine, it's like, okay, right, everything's lined up. You've got an opponent in front of you, a decent opponent who's going to come to win. He has, it's really been, you've had to take the rough with the smooth. He's managed to get the win, but there's been a lot of criticism, and I don't think much of it is unfair, if I'm being totally honest. With Joshua Buatsi, he is very capable. This is someone who's very athletic, has that pedigree of being with Team GB, and you can see there's definitely some substance there. But for me, there are some weaknesses. I'd say that Joshua Buatsi, with that viciousness, he's very offensive-minded, and he just doesn't have that defensive mindset. And I know some people, they poo-poo stuff like this because they think, oh, how can you say this guy isn't professional-minded when he's, beating everyone he's been in with, that kind of thing. Well, the old adage is that styles make fights. And from what I've seen, what I've learned over the years, and I'm sure many other people who agree, a fighter's personality can really influence their approach to the ring and their style. And some may argue it's actually the main influence is someone's psychological makeup, and their intention will actually be a good indicator of how they approach boxing in a practical sense. And I think that's the case with Joshua Buatsi. He's a very intense person when it comes to competing. And you see that in his style where, particularly when he has a guy hurt or he's starting to get some momentum, he can be very, very vicious. But a lot of it's offensively minded. We see the defenses in many of his toughest tests, against the best level opposition that he's been in against, his defense has been lacking, I think it's fair to say, particularly when he's up against someone who's taller than him and maybe a bit more of a long range fighter or longer range fighter than him. Whereas Dan Azeez, on the flip side, he's someone who's a bit more on the shorter side at light heavy, and he's actually had some very good performances against taller opposition, where he has that style that's kind of been modelled off of Marvin Hagler. He comes in with the boots and the socks and the trunks modelled off after Hagler, but even the style where he has that kind of slightly jerky rhythm to him. Dan Azeez is very much a blue collar, spit and sawdust type fighter. I think he likes embracing that. He's someone who isn't the most athletic. He's not a couch potato or anything like that. He's just turned up and started boxing. He's obviously relatively fit and athletic, but he's not exactly setting the world alight with highlight reel performances. He's very much someone who's embraced the fact, okay, I'm not the most talented, I'm not the most athletic, but I'm dedicated to my craft and I'm going to do what I have to do to get you out of there. And that's what I'd associate with Dan Azeez, is that craftiness. He's someone who, he's got some tricks up his sleeve. If you look at that rhythm that he fights off of, he's kind of in and out, in and out. He understands how to mix up his shots. He's got decent shot selection. You can kind of see there's maybe a bit more sharpness with Joshua Buatsi, but I feel like Dan Azeez, he is a bit more of a volume puncher in the sense where he uses those lighter shots to kind of get in close, pin you down. Then he uses those to basically set up harder shots, which he can sometimes do. He takes an angle. He makes himself a very small target, and he kind of gets on your chest, and he's able to have quite a bit of success against these taller guys because he closes them down so well a lot of the time. And I've got to say, like, if we're comparing like for like, I've been more impressed with Dan Azeez. I think just because maybe the expectation is lower of him. No disrespect, but that's just, he doesn't have the GB Olympic pedigree. He's had to come up the hard way, and I think he's done a good job. Obviously, he won the European title. When was that? End of 2022. Oh no, that was early 2023. Time flies, man. But yeah, Dan Azeez is, he's on his way to cleaning up domestically. He's fought a lot of guys on the domestic scene, and he's dealt with them in pretty good fashion. That being said, though, if we're comparing the two of them and trying to formulate a prediction, I've got to be honest, even though I've been more impressed with Dan Azeez over the years, I struggled to pick him in this fight. I just think stylistically, I'm not sure how much he has to trouble Joshua Buatsi. Now, maybe there's a scenario where Dan Azeez is just firing on all cylinders and he's active for the large majority of a round, and he's able to outwork and outland Joshua Buatsi over the course of a fight. But personally, I think that Buatsi, even though he has some defensive limitations, I oftentimes will see him, he doesn't really come off the center line much. He's a bit rigid in the spine. And that's despite the fact that when he's throwing his punches and he gets into that kind of finishing mode, you can see some serious torque, and the way he just tears through opponents with these very wide arcing shots. It's that, once again, it comes back to that defensive mindedness, because he can do it with a high velocity haymaker, but he just doesn't have that defensive eye, that defensive responsibility to come off the center line sometimes. And so maybe he could be getting touched up a little bit, particularly early in a fight before he's warmed into it. But I think that Dan Azeez just lacks the firepower to really keep Joshua Buatsi off him and keep him honest. And so I'm fairly confident in picking Joshua Buatsi to win this fight, and probably by a stoppage as well. Because the thing is, Joshua Buatsi has that killer instinct, and there is a significant size difference between these two. And I think Joshua Buatsi, even though he can be a little bit wild and sometimes he can swing for the fences, I think there is a certain sharpness that he does have to his work and his punches when he's able to pin a fighter down, which I suspect he will be able to do against Dan Azeez. I've met both of these guys personally on quite a few occasions, and obviously I've been able to size them up. And Joshua Buatsi is absolutely enormous. I know Hatman has given a testament to this. He's seen Joshua Buatsi in person before, and he said he's really tall. He is, but not only tall, he's just a big guy all around. Whereas Dan Azeez, You know, he's listed at 5'10". I think that's maybe even a bit generous. Maybe he's closer to 5'9". He's a very small guy, very compact, and he makes that work because, as I say, he's able to get up close. He makes himself a small target, and quite strangely, he actually has quite long arms. You know, you see him in his fights, you see that he's doesn't really struggle sometimes to reach guys who are much taller than him. So he's got quite long arms for his height, much like Richard Bolotniks, who had a decent amount of success against Joshua Buatsi. The only thing is, I think Bolotniks is a bit more of he's a bit craftier. He's even craftier than Dan Azeez, has a bit better schooling. And even then, Bolotniks, we saw how that fight ended. He had some success. He was able to tee off a couple of moments on Joshua Buatsi, but ultimately he was ground down and swiftly taken out in the was that the 11th round when they fought back in 2021. Yeah, if you know, just a bit of an anecdote. I've seen Joshua Buatsi, Dan Azeez, Anthony Yard, Dimitri Bivol. I've seen them all up close, so I feel like I'm able to gauge the height. And out of those four, and the size, out of those four, Joshua Buatsi is by far the biggest. You know, Anthony Yard on camera, he looks like a big guy. You know, solid 6 foot, muscular, but in comparison to Joshua Buatsi, he is enormous. I can't stress it. And the thing is as well, like, he's a big guy and he's lean and he's super, super strong. You know, this is someone who, he comes into the gym and he's squatting 100 kilos, 110 kilos cold, you know, minimal warm up. So he's got that wiry strength because he's not the biggest, bulkiest guy, very naturally strong, and once again has that intensity. I suspect, I wouldn't be surprised, if I'm honest, if this fight ends early. Just because Joshua Buatsi, even though he's not the most defensive, when he gets into a trade, he is very sharp. He can get wild, but I think for the most part, he can hold his shape together. And Dan Azeez himself can be a little bit guilty of winging those punches and being a little bit wide of his shots. So I'm quite confident in picking Joshua Buatsi to win this fight by stoppage. I want to say, maybe a bit more inclined to say that it goes a few rounds. I don't think this fight is going to be fought at a blistering pace. I think both guys will respect the other, and they're going to be looking to earn their offensive opportunities rather than run any red lights. But I think there will be moments where they maybe trade. There might be some explosions of actions that are fairly intermittent. And I suspect that when we get those instances, they could trade. I think that Joshua Buatsi might come out on top, and he might hurt, he might buzz Dan Azeez, and from then I think it's going to be a bit of an uphill struggle for Azeez, because I just think Joshua Buatsi might just be all over him like a rash. And when Joshua Buatsi gets someone hurt, it is quite impressive the way he strings his shots together. He's very creative with his punches, particularly when a fighter's up against the ropes. If you're moving away, Joshua Buatsi can get a little bit ragged, a little bit wild. But if he pins you down on the ropes, it's, you know, time to eat some heavy leather. So, yeah, I'm going with Joshua Buatsi by stoppage. You know what? I might just take a punt. I might take a punt and say he gets it done early. I think if Dan Azeez is able to get out the first 2 rounds, then I think the fight goes a little bit longer, and he'd be able to prolong it a bit. But then I think Joshua Buatsi might then catch up to him again, maybe rounds 7, 8, 9. So not the most concise prediction. I am going for Joshua Buatsi by stoppage, either first 2 rounds or maybe later, closer towards the championship rounds, or maybe just before, like 7, 8, 9. So hopefully that's not too much of a scatterbrain video, but yeah, those are my thoughts. Hopefully it's a good fight. Obviously it was supposed to happen not long ago, but it's been pushed back to now. But yeah, let me know what you guys think of this fight in the comment section below. Who do you think wins and how? Leave it down there, I'll get back to you. But for now, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you on the next video.